Hello and welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be discussing Native Americans and the tensions that are rising between Native Americans and American settlers. This tension it's been there for a very long time since the first Spanish, British people have moved to the Americas. There has been tension between Europeans and the natives that have been living in the land, and that is really going to turn violent in a lot of instances. What happens to the Native Americans is absolutely tragic. Eventually, what's going to happen through a multitude of different methods, including warfare and disease and essentially relocation and deprivation, we're going to see the eradication of most Native Americans in North America, which is, absolutely a devastating thing. The relations have, essentially kind of always been contentious. Now, when we talk about these things and we talk about groups of people, you got to understand that no groups are monolithic. That means that they're not all the same. It doesn't mean all European settlers didn't come to the United States with this idea of stealing Native American land, and all natives, didn't fight back. All natives weren't also weren't supportive of the European settlers, and so unfortunately, in lectures like these, we don't have time to go into the minutia of who exactly was out to get native lands. We have to talk about groups in monolithic nature, but I think that sometimes leads to some divisiveness in the modern sense, and so we got to be really careful about how we talk about groups, and we have to understand that when we say all European settlers are coming in taking land from Native Americans, that doesn't mean that all European settlers are doing that, but it does mean that some of the most powerful of the European settlers are doing that, and so the end result is going to be disastrous for Native Americans. So that tension has essentially always been there, and once the United States gains its independence from Great Britain, that relationship will get worse. And so the British, when they controlled the colonies, they didn't really necessarily have the idea to use all of the land in North America and all of the resources. And so they kind of viewed Native Americans as, hey, look, we are where we are in North America. And if you just kind of, stay where you're at, controlling most of the land, we're fine with you being there. They viewed natives kind of the same way that they viewed American colonists. And so although there was tension there wasn't the amount of tension after the Revolutionary War. After the Revolutionary War, when America comes into existence, we really kind of look at all of the land to the west as an opportunity for economic growth. And when our culture, and then the problem is that Native Americans are on that land, and so what will happen is, at first, through a system of just like an unorganized manner, settlers are just going to slowly encroach on native land. But then, as we start acquiring more and more land, it starts to become more systematic, and we start to systematically take that land from Native Americans. And a lot of the problems here are going to stem from the two different cultural ideas on how land should be used. Europeans tend to believe in private ownership of land. That if you take a piece of land, that piece of land is yours. You improve upon it. That gives you just kind of even more rights to that land, and you get to determine what happens on that land at all points of time. And Native Americans don't have that same understanding of the usage of land. And so when the first Native Americans, they really kind of, it's more of a communal use. It's like, yeah, I'm using it now. Nature provides for everything. I'm going to hunt on this land. When I leave, if you hunt on this land, it's fine. That's not to say that Native Americans aren't territorial. Now we know that they were, and that they had fought wars amongst themselves over land, but it was not so much about private ownership. And so, the those two differing ideas of how land should be used is really going to create tension, because the Europeans are going to look at the way that natives use land, and they're going to think, oh, you're hunting and gathering. That's not the most effective use of land. The most effective use of land is agriculture, farming, that requires private ownership. And so their belief is, well, you're not using this land right. We will. So since we use it better, it should be ours. And they're going to use that as justification. And so they're going to want to just take as much of the natives' land as possible. And because the natives view the land as communal ownership, a lot of the natives aren't going to understand some of the deals that they enter into with Europeans, and people of European descent will take advantage of that. And so, when a European American settler comes and wants some land from a Native American, they will, say, hey, we would like to buy this land from you and be able to use this land. I'll give you X, Y, and Z for the land. Rifles, horses, money, whatever. Whiskey, and a lot of times, which is going to become a problem for Native Americans. And the natives are going to be thinking, oh, are you giving me some sort of tribute to be able to use the land when I'm not using it? And they're not understanding, when they're signing these treaties for land, that it means that they're never going to be able to get that land back. And so, they sign them, and then, they migrate and leave to, hunt buffalo or do whatever. And then when they come back, they're shocked to find out that these permanent settlements have been built on their land, and that if they try to enter that land that was historically theirs, that settlers will call out the militia and fight them off. And so, eventually Native Americans get it, and they understand signing into these treaties is a bad idea. But by then they've had already lost most of the East Coast, and then we'll see a series of treaties and treaty violations that are just going to continue to push Native Americans further and further west. So, we see that there is, this increase in tensions as settlers move further and further west. Once we get to, essentially the European descendants, and I say that because, it more properly encapsulates who's doing this taking of the land. Some of it was done during colonial America. Some of it's done during by actual Americans. We are going to very quickly push the Native Americans west of the Appalachian Mountains. Once they get west of the Appalachian Mountains, you're going to see a series of treaty violations where the Native Americans will actually be following the terms of the agreements that they make with the American government, but it's settlers that are violating the treaty, American settlers that are violating the treaty. And so what you see happen is that the natives and the American government come up with some sort of agreement. And so they say, this land over here is ours, this land over here is yours. And then we essentially tell natives, if as long as you stay on your area, we'll leave you alone, and you just leave us alone on our area. But then what happens is that the American settlers fill up their area. We've got massive amounts of immigration. We're filling up our land quickly, and to make a quick economic buck, settlers are thinking, well, you know what? Those Native Americans aren't farming that land over there that we had promised them, and so settlers slowly start to creep into Native American lands, and they're squatting, right? Which is essentially using land without owning it. Well, as they're squatting there, the natives will get upset. And they're like, well, that's our land, legally our land. We signed a treaty with the American government. That's our land. And they'll want to get that land back. And when they go to get that land back, there'll be some sort of incident, right? Violent incident. And it can be, sometimes it's legitimate where the natives say, get off the land, or, we're coming after you, which is their right because it is their land. Or the settlers will be there and they're going to want to get greedy and they're going to want to get that land, not just squat on that land, but own it legally. And they'll make a claim that a native stole their horse or something along those lines. And there'll be a call for the militia to come out, which is like the local military. The militia will come out. The two sides will fight. The Native Americans, after the Revolutionary War, essentially, their military strength is pretty wiped out. They're not able to stand against an American military force. We fight. We defeat the natives, and once we defeat the natives, we form a new treaty. So we take more of their land and then force them further west to worse land. And this process starts over again. We fill up the land that we got in the new treaty. Slowly, settlers start to realize they can move further west into native land. There's some sort of incident again. The militia gets called out. There's another conflict. Boom, we force them to sign another treaty and we move them further and further west. And so that pattern is essentially going to repeat itself until we've got the modern reservation system today, and the native population is completely wiped out. Now, that series of fights, really the natives after the Revolutionary War, where many of them sided with, the British, had they split kind of, and so some supported the revolution, some supported the British, and then after the War of 1812, the fight is just not. There's not going to be much fight left with the Native Americans, and so they pretty much just have to accept what happens. And we'll talk about that in further lectures. We'll talk about that during the War of 1812 and Tecumseh's role in that, and then we'll talk about removal policy under Andrew Jackson. I've already posted lectures on YouTube about extermination policy under Eisenhower, and how Nixon tried to normalize that after the AIM, the American Indian movement in the 1960s and 70s. So we'll talk about all that in future lectures. So what's happening here? Right. So the natives have, essentially been weakened. There are several different ways that native tribes, and again, and goes back to, we're talking about, essentially, European settlers, American settlers, and natives, and we're talking about them in monolithic groups. And so we kind of have to do that in these lectures. But you got to understand that not all American settlers are going after native land. Not all European settlers were going after native land, although, like I said before, a lot of the most powerful people did, and bad things happen because of that. But all natives aren't, monolithic either. And so the natives, different tribes all have different histories, different traditions, and they're all going to have different approaches to how to deal with the ever expanding America. And so there's several different possible responses Native Americans can have. And we're going to talk about these in turn. First is assimilation. Second is blending of cultures. Third is returning to traditionalism. And fourth is military action. And so we'll talk about each of those in some first is assimilation, and that is merging into white culture. The idea is, and so, a lot of what, George Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and a lot of our founding fathers, a lot of what they were saying about the native problem was that natives should assimilate. There was this feeling of superiority. And again, a lot of that boils down to land usage and technology, right? These two separate cultures. The American culture had, the better weaponry. They have, just in general, the better technology. I would say better educated, but it depends on what you mean by education. And they believed they had a superior form of land usage, which is, farming. And because of that, the idea was, if you as a people want to survive, you need to be more like us, and so you kind of need to give up your way of life, and that's assimilation. Sorry, it means you need to convert to Christianity, you need to learn English, you need to accept democracy, you need to accept capitalism, and you need to give up your migratory patterns, and you need to take up private ownership of land, farming, and things of that nature. And so many natives will actually attempt that. They're going to attempt those European cultural values. The problem is that it's easy to say you should assimilate, but it's going to be very difficult for that to actually happen. And America has really kind of always said to immigrants and to and although natives aren't, but and said to minorities, is assimilation is what you need to do, and most immigrant groups don't find that very difficult. The problem with Native American assimilation is that when an Irish person assimilates into American culture, as long as they speak English and are supportive of democracy, and that you can't really tell the difference between a second generation Irishman and a second generation Frenchman in America. You can, unfortunately, well, I say unfortunately for the time, you can tell a Native American apart because of skin color. And so even though a lot of the founding fathers say Native Americans should assimilate, what is ultimately going to happen is most Native Americans won't be allowed to assimilate because they're noticeably physically different. A great example of that is the Cherokee. The Cherokee, after the Revolutionary War, their ability to fight is so significantly diminished that what they do is they say, you know what, we are a Southern tribe in the Georgia, Florida region, and we're just going to assimilate into American culture. What they do is they learn English. For the most part, they convert to Christianity. They're going to write a constitution, so they're democratic. They are going to take up farming. And as a matter of fact, they're going to so assimilate into Southern American culture that the Cherokee are going to be slave owners. And so that's as assimilated as you can get. And during the Jackson administration, we're still going to give them the boot. And so, you can't get more assimilated than the Cherokee. And we're just going to see that, that's not going to be accepted, and they will be removed. Right. So it's tough to do, and they're not really going to be accepted into society. The next idea that tribes can use to deal with the encroaching Americans is the blending of cultures, and that's just when natives try to preserve certain aspects of their culture but adopt some European traits as well. This is kind of what America is, right? We're a melting pot, and so we've got all kinds of different cultures here. And what each culture is supposed to do is, keep the best parts of their culture and adapt the better parts of other cultures. And so then that's how we all kind of, meld together and get along. And so that's kind of the idea here. And so the people that are blending the cultures, they're going to a lot of times be, they're going to try and keep their traditions, a lot of times keep their religion, but they're going to maybe pick up farming or learn English. So they'll pick up certain aspects of American culture. Many of these Native Americans are going to be pushed onto reservation systems, and the reservation systems are going to be absolutely disastrous for Native Americans because the reservation, that's just land that's designated for natives that eventually they'll have at least the majority of autonomy over. But that land is going to be the worst land that Americans don't want. And so it's going to be really hard to make a living, and it's going to cause some real serious problems. There's also structural problems within the reservation system as well, governmental problems that within the reservation system as well. But at the end of the day, it's really bad. As a matter of fact, as far as minorities in the United States go today, Native Americans are by far have it the worst. Highest illiteracy rates, highest alcoholism rates. It's some of the highest poverty rates. It's really a bad situation. It's a bad situation that not very many people talk about, and probably should be addressed. So, the blending of cultures and assimilation, natives are encouraged to abandon war. It's meant to be, a peaceful approach to dealing with the settlement issues. Again, blending of cultures is still going to have that, maybe that, you know, sounds reasonable, but at the end of the day, it's they're still just not going to be accepted into mainstream society in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And so these tribes will try to adopt white agriculture and land usage, but we'll still see struggles. Now, the next approach is going to be a rejection of that. Both of those two approaches, blending of cultures and why am I struggling? Assimilation. And this is going to be traditionalism. Traditionalism is going to essentially, the Prophet Wakova and others are going to essentially, they're going to be looking around and they're going to say, hey, we had it pretty good before these Europeans showed up. Right, our way of life was good, but when these Europeans showed up, and they showed up with their horses, right? It was the Spanish that brought horses to the Americas. They showed up with their guns and their whiskey, and all of a sudden things started getting pretty bad for us. And so, if things were good before Europeans showed up and got bad after Europeans showed up, well, then if we want things to go back to being good, we should return to our traditional ways of life, our traditional beliefs, and we should reject European society. And essentially what the prophet ends up saying and ends up preaching is, that essentially, we're because we've rejected our ideals, that God has just rejected us. And so if we want for the spirits to be on our side again, we need to reject European values, and what we need to do is go back to our traditional belief system. No more whiskey, no more guns, none of that. And so reject this white European culture, because natives were being punished for spiritually being punished for moving away from those traditional values. Now, the prophet, who is related to Tecumseh, who is going to be one of the greatest war chiefs, that is still fighting the Native Americans, or sorry, still fighting the Americans. The prophet is preaching this idea of go shirts, that if you really truly reject white culture, and practice these traditional values, that and you perform this one specific ritual, the ghost dance, you'll get what is called a ghost shirt, which will make you impervious to bullets. And so you can you take your bow and arrow and you give the braves to do this one traditional dance, and then when they go out to fight the Americans, that we'll have this spiritual protection. They'll protect us from bullets. Well, you can imagine that that's not going to work out well. And so this traditionalism will be put down, and put down pretty harshly. It will fall apart after the followers of the prophet skirmish at places like Tippecanoe. So traditionalism will, unfortunately, not be successful. So the next approach is military action. And I think one of the best examples of that is going to be Tecumseh. He is going to continue to be fighting the Native Americans' fight against the settlers. He after the Treaty of Greenville, which essentially gave up the southern 2/3 of Ohio to the Americans. He's going to continue. He's going to reject that treaty. He's going to say, the Treaty of Greenville that gave up, Fort Detroit. All of that is illegitimate. He's going to continue to advocate for the continuing warlike resistance against the Americans. He's going to tell Native Americans that they have to all put aside their tribal differences to, gather together to fight back the Americans, and is really going to garner quite a bit of support. He's going to be backed by the British. The British had forts and soldiers out in, Canada and in the Western Territories. And they had been funding Tecumseh, providing him with weapons because honestly, the British are looking to take back as much of their colonial empire as possible in the Americas. And so, Tecumseh gets support from the British, and when the War of 1812 breaks out, Tecumseh and his braves will side with the British. There's some initial success there. They're going to take back Fort Detroit, but eventually, Tecumseh will be killed at Fort Detroit, and the Americans are going to. I don't know if we're going to call it a win. The War of 1812. We're going to win the last battle, even though it happened after the treaty was signed to end the war, but. Ultimately, what is certain is that the Native Americans that sided with the British are going to be so decimated that any major resistance to American settlement will end with Tecumseh's death at the War of 1812. So, these warlike tribes that are mostly led by Tecumseh are going to recognize that the treaties have been manipulated over and over again by the Americans, and they're going to resist it militarily. And we'll talk in later lectures about some of these important battles and some of the wins and losses there. And like I said, we'll make it a point to touch back in future lectures on kind of what's happening with Native Americans all along the way. So that concludes our lecture today. I appreciate your time, and I will see you again shortly.